Camping always felt like freedom to me. No deadlines, no distractions, just the serenity of nature. That's why I agreed when my friends Ben and Emily suggested we camp in that forest. Yeah, we'd heard the stories about the Watcher, but we laughed them off. Urban legends, you know. The first day was perfect. We hiked through beautiful trails, set up our tent by a lake, and roasted marshmallows by the fire. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest changed. The cheerful bird song was replaced by an oppressive silence. We tried to lighten the mood around the fire. Ben joked about the Watcher. What's he going to do? Stare at us menacingly? The laughter stopped when we heard the growl. It was low, guttural, and came from somewhere just beyond the firelight. Ben grabbed his flashlight and swept it across the trees. Nothing. Probably just an animal, he muttered, but his voice wavered. We decided to call it a night, but sleep didn't come easy. I lay in my tent, staring at the nylon ceiling, when I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. Ben? I whispered. No answer. The steps stopped outside my tent. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. I held my breath, waiting for I don't know what. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps moved away. The next morning, we all admitted we'd heard something. Emily swore she heard whispers. Ben said he saw someone watching us from the trees. I wanted to leave, but Ben insisted we stay. Pride, maybe. That night the Watcher came. We were sitting around the fire when he stepped into the light. A man, if you could call him that. He was tall, impossibly thin, with hollow eyes that gleamed in the firelight. His smile was the worst part, jagged and too wide for his face. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. He didn't blink either. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his head tilted to one side like a curious predator studying its prey. The firelight flickered over his skin, which looked waxy, almost translucent. I could see veins snaking under the surface, pulsing faintly. His clothes were tattered, hanging off his gaunt frame like rags. But it was his hands that made my stomach churn. Long, skeletal fingers that twitched and flexed, as though they were trying to decide which one of us to grab first. Ben's flashlight beam wavered as he shone it directly at the man. The light hit his face, and I wish it hadn't. His eyes weren't just hollow, they were wrong. Empty sockets that should have been filled with darkness instead gleamed with an unnatural milky light that seemed to move, swirling like smoke trapped in glass. "Stay back," Ben barked, his voice trembling. He stood clutching a stick from the fire like a weapon. The man, or whatever he was, didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Slowly, his smile widened, stretching his face inhumanly, as if the corners of his mouth were being pulled by invisible hooks. The fire sputtered, dimming, and for a moment I thought it was going out entirely. The shadows around him seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if they were alive. Emily whimpered beside me, clutching my arm. I could feel her nails digging into my skin, but I didn't dare move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, pinned in place by the weight of his gaze. And then he moved. It wasn't a normal movement. His body jerked forward in a series of unnatural spasms, like a marionette being yanked by its strings. One moment he was at the edge of the firelight. The next, he was standing right in front of Ben. I didn't even see him cross the distance. He just appeared. Ben swung the burning stick, but the man caught it effortlessly. His fingers didn't flinch as the flames licked at his hand. The stick crumbled into ash in his grasp, and Ben stumbled backward, tripping over a log. "What do you want?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's head snapped toward me too fast. like a bird noticing a sudden movement. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then slowly, he raised one long, bony finger and pointed at me. My heart stopped. His hand lingered there for what felt like an eternity before he turned it, pointing at Emily, then Ben. One by one, he pointed at each of us, as if marking us in some way. His smile never faltered. And then he did something I'll never forget. He leaned down, impossibly low, his face inches from Ben's, and took a deep, shuddering breath. It was as if he were inhaling Ben's very presence, drawing something out of him. When he straightened, Ben looked pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, like he'd just seen the end of the world. The man stepped back, his movements unnervingly smooth now, as if the earlier jerking spasms had been a facade. He looked at each of us one last time, his hollow eyes gleaming brighter for a brief moment. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked backward into the forest. Not walked exactly. He melted into the shadows. One moment he was there, his jagged smile still visible in the dying firelight, and the next he was gone. The darkness swallowed him whole. For several minutes none of us spoke. We just sat there, staring at the spot where he'd vanished. The fire crackled weakly, struggling to stay alive. Ben was the first to move, his trembling hands fumbling to grab his pack. "We're leaving," he muttered, his voice hollow. None of us argued. We packed in silence, too terrified to speak. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, the forest felt different. Every tree seemed to lean closer. Every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that jagged smile staring back at me. We didn't see him again. But as we reached the car, we found something waiting for us. On the hood was a pile of small bones, arranged in a perfect circle. At the center lay Ben's flashlight, the one he swore he'd been holding when we packed up. We drove away without looking back, but even now I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching, waiting. I moved into the apartment because it was cheap, and after the divorce I couldn't afford much. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm. High ceilings, creaky wooden floors, even a clawfoot tub. The landlord mentioned something about its history, but I waved it off. What old building doesn't have a story? The first few nights were fine, quiet, peaceful even. Then the calls started. It was 3 a.m. when my phone rang for the first time. I groggily answered, only to hear silence on the other end. I hung up and went back to bed, figuring it was a wrong number. The next night the phone rang again at exactly the same time. I answered faster this time, but again, silence. I tried to shake it off, but a creeping unease started to settle in. The pattern continued, night after night, 3 a.m., the phone ringing like clockwork. By the 5th night I was on edge. When the phone rang, I snatched it up immediately. This time I heard something, breathing, slow, deliberate breathing. It was faint but unmistakable. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. No response, just breathing. I slammed the phone down, my heart racing. Sleep was out of the question after that. The next morning, I called the phone company, but they said there was nothing wrong with the line. Probably a prank, they told me. That didn't make me feel any better. Things escalated. One night, the breathing turned into whispers. I couldn't make out all the words, but the phrases I did catch made my skin crawl. "I'm here, watching, so cold." I unplugged the phone, thinking that would be the end of it. But that night, I woke up to the sound of whispering in my apartment. Not from the phone, from inside the room. I sat up, my heart pounding. The whispers stopped as soon as I turned on the light. I searched the entire apartment, but there was no one there. The doors were locked, the windows closed. I told myself I was imagining things. The final straw came a week later. The call came, as it always did, at 3 a.m. My phone, which I'd unplugged days ago, rang out loud and clear. My chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at me not to answer, but my hand moved on its own, trembling as I brought the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I whispered. This time the voice wasn't deep or guttural. It was soft, almost childlike, with a lilting, sing-song tone. "I'm so glad you picked up." I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who are you? What do you want?" There was a pause, and then a giggle. It sounded wrong, high-pitched and hollow, like it was coming from something that had never truly laughed before. "I've been here for so long," the voice continued. "I've waited and waited, but now I think it's time." "Time for what?" I managed to choke out, my throat dry. "Look behind you." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey as I sat there, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. "If you don't, I'll have to come closer." My head felt heavy, as if an invisible hand was forcing it to turn. My vision swam as I slowly shifted my gaze over my shoulder. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of my bedside lamp. At first, I saw nothing. But then, in the corner of the room, the shadows began to shift. They twisted and writhed, growing darker, denser, until they took shape. A figure stood there. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and contorted at unnatural angles. Its face was obscured, but its head tilted slightly, as though it were studying me. Then, 2 pinpricks of light appeared where its eyes should have been, cold and piercing, like twin stars in the void. The phone in my hand crackled. The voice was no longer childlike. It was deep, ancient, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have looked." The figure took a step forward. I dropped the phone and scrambled backward, pressing myself against the headboard. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, tendrils of darkness reaching for my legs. And then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was silent again, the phone lying lifeless on the floor. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. The shadows in the corners of my home feel heavier now, as if they're watching, waiting. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear it again. "Look behind you." I was driving down Highway 50, the loneliest road in America, they call it. I'd laughed at the name when I set out, but after hours of endless desert and nothing but the faint buzz of my engine, I wasn't laughing anymore. It was midnight, and the stars above felt so close I could almost touch them. No streetlights, no cars, just me and the vast, silent expanse. That's when I saw her. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A figure on the side of the road, out here. But as I got closer, my headlights illuminated a young woman, her pale face startlingly bright against the dark night. She wore a thin, tattered dress, and I could see her shivering. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's common sense, right? But something about her, I don't know. Maybe it was the way she stood there looking so fragile. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked. She nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. When she climbed into the car, the temperature dropped. I'm not exaggerating. It was like someone had turned on an invisible air conditioner. I glanced at her. She was staring straight ahead, clutching her arms like she was freezing. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Just down the road," she murmured. I nodded and kept driving, but the unease was growing in my chest. Her clothes looked outdated, like something from the 80s, And the way she spoke, it was off, like she wasn't used to talking. "Your car break down?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. She hesitated before answering. Something like that. Her voice sent a shiver down my spine, and I decided not to press her further. After a while, she pointed ahead to a dim outline of a building. "There. Stop there." It was an old gas station, abandoned and covered in graffiti. The windows were shattered, and the pumps were rusted hulks. I turned to ask her if she was sure, but when I looked, she was gone. Just gone. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard the door open or close. She couldn't have just disappeared. I got out of the car, scanning the area, but there was no sign of her. Then I saw the bench. It was near the entrance to the station, covered in dust and weeds. Sitting on it was a faded photograph. I picked it up, and my stomach flipped. It was her. The same dress, the same face. Underneath it was a yellowed newspaper clipping. "Local girl killed in hit-and-run accident, 1983. I backed away, my hands trembling. I ran to my car and jumped in, slamming the door. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. But as I put it into gear, I glanced in the rear-view mirror, and there she was, sitting in the back seat. Her face was hollow, her eyes dark voids. "Thanks for the ride," she whispered. I don't remember much after that. Somehow I made it home, but I'll never drive that stretch of highway again.